So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be continuing kind of our Lenten conversation, looking at kind of the big moves in overall salvation history, in the story of God and how he's acting. So the first week we looked at just the wild story of Noah, the fact that God chooses to limit himself, limit his own ways of responding to evil in the world, right? He says he's not going to destroy the world ever again like that. The next covenant we looked at last week was that with Abram, the fact that he has called a specific person, and he does this kind of throwaway note saying that I'm going to bless you, but it's so that you can be a blessing to the rest of the world. And then this week we're going to look at the Sinai covenant between God and they've now Abram has in fact become a nation, right? Just like he was promised. Hundreds of years later. And we're going to look at this covenant and how this signifies a next kind of major move. God promises to protect and save the entire world. God promises to bless the entire world. And we're going to see a little bit more of how that works, that God reveals himself as a savior kind of at the end of this story. So let me first start out by just reading kind of this arrival at Mount Sinai from Exodus chapter 19. On exactly the 3rd month anniversary of the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt, they came into the Sinai desert. They traveled to Rephidim, came to the Sinai desert, and set up camp there. Israel camped there in front of the mountain while Moses went up to God. And the Lord called to him from the mountain, "This is what you shall say to Jacob's household and declare to the Israelites, You saw what I did to the Egyptians, and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you with me. So now, if you faithfully obey me and stay true to my covenant, you will be my most precious possession out of all the peoples, since the whole earth belongs to me. You will be a kingdom of priests for me and a holy nation. These are the words you should say to the Israelites." So Moses came down, called together the people's elders, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all responded with one voice, "Everything that the Lord has said, we will do." Moses reported to the Lord what the people had said. So that kind of first key word there is "you have seen what the Lord has done," right? Now, this is something that was promised very specifically to Abram. It's something that Joseph was aware of as well, his great-grandson, promising that his people would eventually leave Egypt. So just kind of the quick and dirty on the Exodus is God's people had been living because of the famine, because of Joseph, who was working for Pharaoh. They lived in Egypt. But lo and behold, 400 years later, they've grown to an immense people, and the Egyptians have grown afraid of them because they are different, because they are powerful. And those in power often fear both of those things in large populations who are different, right? And so they oppress them horribly. They become slaves. They are responsible for building, many of the pyramids, many of the cities, and they cry out to God, saying, "You promised to take us back home. You promised to cry us free." And God chooses a very unusual person for this, a man named Moses, who starts out as one of the princes. He becomes a murderer. He becomes an exile and a shepherd, and God reveals himself in the desert to him and goes back and through him does miraculous signs challenging both the religion of Egypt through the series of signs, of plagues they're often called, in which he basically insults each of the Egyptian gods, showing they are not as powerful as he is, and ultimately challenges Pharaoh himself, who is also treated as a god, showing, no, I say let these people go, let them go. And so they go out. They are freed. They're practically driven out into the desert. And then as they come to a shoreline, Pharaoh goes, "Oh man, that really was good help. I need to get them back." Comes and tries to attack them in their army. They freak out. God parts the Red Sea. The ocean itself stands up like walls on the sides. They walk through safely. Pharaoh tries to follow. The sea comes crashing down on them, and God's people, through just a series of miraculous events, have become truly free. And I think this teaches them one of the important things that this covenant is overall showing, and that this is that God is a savior, right? This will become the foundational story of the Jewish people. As important as the covenants with Noah and Abraham and their creation story and those sorts of things are, this is what's going to be define them as a people. And I think it's important to recognize that this covenant is one that kind of cuts both ways, right? God is binding himself to them, they are binding themselves to God. They have very specific requirements on this one, much more so than even in the Abraham story. But at this point, this is not a transaction, right? God has freed them. He said he was going to, and he has. They are welcome to kind of wander about on their own. They are not required to enter into this specific covenant, even though God desires and has plans for them. So I love the metaphor that is brought up here and is really brought out even more in the kind of Deuteronomy passage when Moses is retelling and reminding them this image of I've carried you on eagle's wings. One of the comments I read this week that I thought was kind of funny is pointing out, the people who have been marching in the desert for 3 months, who are probably hot and dirty and whose feet probably hurt, may not have felt immediately that God swept them up on eagle's wings those last few months, right? It kind of points out, I think, a funny way we tend to approach God, in that we would much rather be swept up and get to fly and feel cool and make it easy because, we're God's beloved people, than what the metaphor is actually probably trying to get at. Yes, God is carrying them, but the reason eagles carry their young is to teach them to fly. They don't carry them to make it easy. They don't intend on carrying them forever. In fact, they tend to push them out of the nest, right? And if they fall, if they're not ready yet, if they're too scared or don't have the muscles or whatever, their parent catches them, carries them back up to where it is safe, and makes them try again. And so it's funny, we tend to want to see God's love as some kind of a privilege that will make our lives easy, when even a metaphor like this, I carried you on eagle's wings, in fact, I think is reminding us of the maturity and the growing up, but also at the same time, the learning to fly that God is inviting us into, that God is inviting the Israelites into as well. And so they jump on it, right? They immediately say, yes, we want to do this thing. We want to respond. And that's going to be kind of the next huge section of the Bible. The fact that they say, yes, we want to enter into this covenant, we want to have a new identity, is where the Torah comes from, which is where the series of regulations of eating, the rhythms of their life come from, that is going to define their identity. I think we may be overly familiar at times with, I think, the caricature of what the Torah can be and should have been from Jesus butting heads with people in the New Testament who have a very specific view of what the law is and the way it should be interpreted and what it says about God, right? This just very stickler, very harsh view, which Paul is also going to react against in the New Testament, saying, look, Christ's work is enough. You don't have to change. You don't have to enter into these kind of same rhythms, these same habits, these same ways of being that the Jewish people did. And so I think we can see this as kind of an oppressive thing, but you have to remember, I think they experienced it at first, at least, when they were willing to trust God, when they were willing to express their trust, as a sort of freedom, as a sense of identity that they've not had before. They are a slave people. They're not allowed to have their own cultural institutions. They're not allowed to have their own rhythms of life. And so just basically in a very short period of time, they've changed places, they've lost all governmental structure, they've lost most of the things that structured their life, even if they were awful and oppressive. And actually embracing, I think, the freedom and the gift that God is trying to give them in a new cultural identity and a new set of rhythms and a new way of being in the world is one that they kind of fail to embrace. And I think we see this pattern again and again of almost like looking back, trying to go back, trying to be like everybody else, a problem that still haunts us. God does give us structure to our lives even now. And yet, even though I think it is an invitation to freedom, it is an invitation to learn to fly, we complain that God doesn't carry us. We complain and say, this thing's oppressive, it's too hard, it's not what I feel like doing, it makes me too different than everyone else. But that's kind of one of the points. Not that it's hard, the fact that it's counterintuitive, the fact that it makes us trust God rather than trusting ourselves and our ways of doing it. And so, kind of coming out of that covenant, this idea of Torah, these rhythms, these ways of being, God explains here a very important step for both his plans for the salvation of the entire human race and what the identity of his people are supposed to be here. So the very first kind of metaphor he uses is, look, if you faithfully obey me and stay true to my covenant, again, trusting me, doing things my way, you will be my most precious possession out of all the peoples, since the whole earth belongs to me. So they're not special in the sense that they alone belong to God, right? Everything belongs to God. The Bible is very clear. God made everything. He knows and he loves all peoples. And again, I think we hear a phrase like that, treasured possession. We're like, oh, well, I'm the favorite, right? We tend to approach it like I'm a spoiled child, or I'm the beloved pet, or we've all seen people who have some possession that they really treasure and take incredible care of. When I was a kid growing up, it was our neighbor had this car that he just loved. Like, he just lavished attention. He took such amazing care of it, right? And we hear the word treasured possession, and that's where I tend to want to go with it. Like, oh, I'm God's beloved. I'm God's treasured possession, so he's going to kind of pamper me and make things easier. That hasn't been my experience. That doesn't really line up with what Jesus is saying, but it tends to lurk in my heart, wishing that was in fact the truth. Interestingly, the word that is used for this treasured possession in the Old Testament is actually a loan word from other languages at the time, and it has a very specific meaning. The meaning is like something that is set aside for a very specific purpose. So it's kind of like, like a budget line item for us. Like, we're keeping track of this amount of money always goes to this. Or my time in nonprofits, you'll sometimes see something called a designated fund, in which money is put aside, whether from a grant or from a specific donation, but it can only be used for a specific purpose. You just can't use it on the general budget. You can't use it for this or this, even if those become higher needs. It's designated. It has to be used for this exact purpose and what it had in mind. And that's the word, this treasured possession. Does it imply that it's protected? Does it imply that it has meaning? Protected, not so much. Meaning, yeah, it's aimed toward this, but that purpose overall is what we're going to get in some of the other metaphors, and I think why this is such a key moment for God's kind of salvation history. So the next one, he says, you will be a kingdom of priests. So what is a priest? It's a word we're very familiar with. We have images around it, but what is it exactly? I think a priest is someone whose job, whose office is to be kind of a bridge, right? A bridge between God and the rest of the world, a bridge between kind of the transcendent, the spiritual, and the everyday, the mundane. And, in the ancient world, this was a position that held a lot of prestige because people were very afraid of the gods. They felt very out of control. They used kind of magic and religion in a way very similar to the way we use science nowadays. They look at a problem in the world, they try to figure it out and do what they can. And so priests did have a lot of clout, and in many cultures, the Egyptian that they just come out of, Mesopotamia and some of the others, priests were big, important people because they were the ones that could kind of control the powers that felt out of control in the world. And yet, instead of them being special and elite, again, where we tend to want to take something like that, I'm priestly, I'm holy, God says, no, all of you, this rabble that were slaves all of a few months ago, are going to be a nation full of priests. You're all going to be priests. You're all going to be the bridge. And I think the Bible is very clear that the priestly office and later on a kingly office always exist for the sake of serving the greater needs. And so where Israel wants to tell themselves that they are special and better than everyone else, right, that they are apart from them, which is what holy means, which we'll get to in a second, it's actually for their sake. God has chosen this group of people. He has shown who he is. They've experienced God as a savior. in a sort of show and tell way. God has shown them who he is, how he does things, how he wants to save, and they are meant to be kind of the first fruits, the show and tell, the priests, the go-between between God and the rest of the world. And that's kind of what gets brought out in this final one, this holy nation. Holy, again, is one that has some pretty funny connotations, which often does have to do with being like more spiritual and higher up in some way, shape, or form. But holy, the root itself is God. It has something to do with God. It's godish in some ways, but the kind of secondary meaning is more apart, not better than, like side, alternative, just slightly different. It's almost being weird for weird's sake. They are meant to stand out with the way they eat, the way they dress, the rituals of their lives from the rest of the world. They can't look like them because they are the bridge. They are meant to be an invitation into, hey, again, show and tell. Come and see what God's ways are like. Come and see what society can look like that is based on us taking care of one another and trusting God rather than ourselves or violence or political stuff. They didn't live it out. We never live it out, right? But that's the invitation. In some way, shape, or form, God is trying to show what he is like as a savior, what his ways are like, what his love is like to a world that doesn't believe it, that has forgotten whose world it actually belongs to. And so I think this pattern that they enter into is one that we are also invited into in Lent particularly, right? They experienced God's salvation. God did a dramatic, miraculous work in their lives, and he's hoping for a response, which they give him. A response which is not about them being elevated, but about them being kind of set apart and set aside for the sake of the rest of the world. I think they were called to live a certain way, to look a certain way, to behave a certain way, because again, they are supposed to represent and show and tell the rest of the world what God is actually like. They're human, they're deeply flawed, and they do this very poorly, and yet God is able to speak and continue this story of wooing a broken world back to him through these deeply flawed people, just like he still is through deeply flawed people like all of us in the church, which believe we are a continuation of this story. So again, in Lent, we're looking at kind of God's overall story, the fact that he first limits himself and promises to protect and save the world. He will no longer be hostile to the world despite how messed up it is most of the time. And then God points out he does bless. He does bring prosperity. He does bring a way out where there is no way for the sake of blessing the entire world. The things we are given, we are meant to pass on. We see this even more concretely here when God says, I have saved you. I would love you to show the world who I am as a Savior, as a loving God, as a parent who can carry you and teach you to fly, right? So I need you to be different. I need you to treat one another differently. I need you to show what society and rhythms can look like in a very different kingdom. And so that's kind of this next step, this nation of priests, this holy nation, this treasured possession is about God's mission to the world. And we're going to see as we continue to go how this story enriches God to the point that God comes and even sacrifices himself among to believe in what he's doing.